Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world today. Welcome to the session on Newtonian mechanics. I'm going to hand things over to our session chair, Derya, right away. Derya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This is a panel on the reception of Newtonianism in 18th and 19th century Scotland. And we co-organize with my fellow panelists, and I will start by introducing them. But the general idea that interests me as a person, who studies these subjects is working on Newtonian cosmology and its reception, positive or negative. I'm very much interested in dissecting some assumptions that the historiography is making on the subject, like the, kind of the so-called welcoming of Newtonian ideas on the Scottish soil, how it's really tied up very closely to the Scottish Enlightenment and such like. So my continuing interest in this subject comes from there. And I work in Istanbul, and hello from, early evening from Istanbul, and thank you for joining us. So the first co-panelist that I would like to introduce to you is Louis Ashman. Yes, hello, Louis. Louis Ashman is a PhD student in history at the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on the reception of Isaac Newton in the Scottish Enlightenment. So, yeah, we were joking about it, saying that his whole work is on the subject that we're talking about today. So he's the perfect fit for this panel. In his PhD project, Louis aims to provide a new account of Newton's influence on the Scottish Enlightenment by examining understudied texts that engage with Newton's achievements. So there are some more information, but I'm going to leave it to Louis to give his preliminary ideas about this subject.
Thank you. Shall I introduce myself now? Yeah, okay.
Please.
Yes. My topic is our topic for my PhD, which is nearly done. But what my work is really about is looking at how gravitation as something that Newton discovered and as something that he worked on, so his particular treatment of gravitation in the Principia, the way he left the question or questions, if you like. My work's really about how that kind of energized a number of debates in Scotland that cut across quite a few concerns and subject areas in which philosophy was involved. So it's really about the philosophical reception of Newton throughout the 18th century. And what I argue in my work, in the broadest sense, is that just to pick up on your point there about Derya, about the some of the assumptions in the literature, what I'm trying to show with my work is how in this period where we think we have a sort of Newtonian science or Newtonian natural philosophy in 18th century Scotland, trying to show that there was a transformation of natural philosophy. There were substantial changes in natural philosophy across the 18th century, across the period. And the reason for that is this kind of catalytic effect that Newton's particular treatment of gravitation and the fact that he discovered this concept, which the questions around the concept I'm sure we'll get into, but the difficult questions around this, they are really driving debates and engagement with Newton across the period. And in new contexts and in relation to new questions, the discipline of natural philosophy, physics, it undergoes quite significant changes. And these are really around what I argue, physical explanation, what counts as proper, ideal physical explanation. So people are returning to Newton and they're answering this question and related questions differently throughout the period. So that's what I'm saying,
Okay.
or will be saying.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. I mean, we will get back into the specifics of this change, the shift, or the culmination of Newtonian philosophical agenda on the Scottish soil later on. But the second panelist that I would like to introduce is again working on another aspect, same subject, same soil, same kind of chronology, but methodology. So I would like to introduce Tamas Demeter to you. Tamas, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, Derya. Yeah.
Hi. Tamas is Cambridge PhD, Bristol Masters, and he's a professor of philosophy at the Cornelius University at Budapest. And he's the leader of the Lendület Research Group at the Research Center for the Humanities, Budapest. He has published on Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment in relation to various forms of Newtonianism. And the very informative chapter that it's coming, getting published is what mainly I would like to talk to Tamas about, and it's on the methodology. And But before we do that, before we delve into discussion, can you please give us some preliminary information about your research interests in this subject?
Yeah, thank you. Of course. I'm primarily interested in what I call disciplinary integrations in the Scottish Enlightenment. And by disciplinary integrations, I mean those cases where, well, what they called moral and natural philosophy are integrated. So it's a common wisdom that that in the early modern period and in the Enlightenment, natural and moral philosophy were part of the same intellectual enterprise. The divide that we know after C.P. Snow as the two cultures did not exist back then. And I would like to somehow substantiate this claim. And my methodological explorations are inspired by this, well, insight or commitment. So I would like to show that these moral philosophers, that the canon that we know as a philosophical canon of the Scottish Enlightenment and the canon that we know as the, well, history of science in the Scottish Enlightenment should not be treated separately, or at least they can be treated fruitfully and productively as forming a joint and interactive and communicating culture. In this context, I'm primarily interested in two broader fields. One is methodology, as you rightly pointed out, in which context I argue that, well, there are various appropriations of Newton in the period, at least. Well, I distinguish three different forms of appropriation, one being mainly Principia driven enterprise, which existed in natural and moral philosophy equally. In natural philosophy, it was represented, for example, by Colin Maclaurin and his contributions to the refinement of the Principia style of inquiry, and early Francis Hatchism with his attempts at a canon to calculate the unit of benevolence in a given action that was developed in the 1720s. The second trajectory or way of appropriation is or was primarily inspired by Newton's optics, and it took a predominantly chemical and, well, partly physiological form, and it is represented by figures such as David Hume, Adam Smith, William Cullen, Joseph Black, and in that respect, I argue that they their work exhibits remarkable congruences conceptually and methodologically as well. And the third form of appropriation is the common sense school, which is also which was also in a way Newton inspired, as can be read off from Reed's work primarily. But that kind of Newtonianism, this common sense style Newtonianism, also appears in natural philosophy, in Robinson's work, for example. So that's I wouldn't like to talk too much and dominate the discussion with a monologue. So this is the methodological strand that I'm primarily working on and trying to develop eventually into a book. At this stage, it's forthcoming in probably 2 weeks in the second volume of the Oxford History of Scottish Philosophy, edited by James Harris and Aaron Garrett.
Yes.
So that's the advertisement.
Sorry, we'll talk more, definitely, especially the methodology aspect. We will talk more because I have some questions to ask. But next fellow panelist here is Rebekah Higgitt. Rebekah is Principal Curator of Science at the National Museum, Scotland. She's a historian of science and has published widely on British science from the 17th to the 19th centuries. She's interested in the representation of science in images, museums, and literature. But for the purposes of this panel, Rebekah was telling us that she's currently interested in Archibald Campbell, Earl of Islay, later 3rd Duke of Argyll, a powerful political figure whose patronage can be seen to set the scene for the Scottish Enlightenment. And the preliminary remarks, I'm guessing, will be about Islay.
They will be. So yes, I had a lot I wanted to pack in. So if you'll forgive me, I am going to monologue and more or less read so that I can get it all down. So yes, I've been looking at Archibald Campbell, Earl of Islay, later 3rd Duke of Argyll, because I'm in the process, I hope, of acquiring his very magnificent equinoctial ring dial for the museum. So that as an instrument is not Newtonian per se, but it points to Islay's very real and hands-on interest in astronomy and horology and mechanics and technical skill. I have been thinking about Islay. I've been wondering if he can be described as Newtonian, as a Newtonian, and if that's a useful thing to do. He is primarily a politician and lawyer, but this may be helpful anyway. So as you said, Derya, he was very important in terms of his political role in Scotland in the period after the Act of Union. He exercised royal patronage there, but also his own patronage, and that gave him very significant power in shaping Scottish culture and institutions. His biographer, Roger Emerson, argues that by advancing individuals who shared his kinds of outlook and interests, he helped lay the foundations for the Scottish Enlightenment, whatever that means. Emerson talks about the importance of Islay's education in Utrecht as laying the foundations for his interests in science. And there were plenty of Scottish-Dutch connections worth exploring, but I just want to emphasize briefly today links that he had with Newtonians in London and around court in England. His London library was very plentiful, full of mathematical and scientific works, including Newton's works and lots of the popularizations. He was also, for example, a subscriber to Henry Pemberton's view of Sir Isaac Newton's philosophy. It was a family context in many ways. In this kind of London, Surrey kinds of areas. There's a story that Islay's brother, who was the 2nd Duke of Argyll, came across his gardener's son reading Principia in the garden. He assumed this copy was from his own library, so they all had one, but it turned out that it was the gardener's son. So this is a story about an autodidact natural genius, the mathematician Edmund Stone. But I notice in a dedication that he later wrote to the Duke, that he wrote, it was in your family, I first caught an affection for mathematics. So I think that's in a very important context. Stone was later proposed as a Fellow of the Royal Society by John Theophilus Desaguliers, who he may have been introduced to by Euler. Euler was by that time Desaguliers' the godfather to his son. In the same year, we know also that Desaguliers was invited to Edinburgh by John Campbell, the provost there, to improve their water supply. And that again may have been an introduction from Euler. And soon he was the dedicatee and patron of Desaguliers' allegorical poem, The Newtonian System of the World, the Best Model of Government, which, as well known, made an analogy between the Newtonian laws of planetary motion and the natural legitimacy of the Union and the Hanoverian idea of limited monarchy. So he made Euler his exemplar of this. He made him a Newtonian, as he was presenting it here, and flattered his, I quote, consummate knowledge of the laws of nature, which are established in the heavens, as well as the laws of nations, particularly those of Great Britain. So the extent to which Euler was a Newtonian, it was, I would suggest, the Newtonianism that was appropriated and adapted by Desaguliers, aimed particularly at able, practical, entrepreneurial kinds of individuals, as well as this idea of the stability of Hanoverian Britain. So while Euler wasn't an author or, for example, a joiner of societies particularly, he had certainly an impact on Scottish culture through his patronage of individuals that fitted that kind of picture. People like Desaguliers certainly, but also others we will hear about in this conversation: Hutcheson, Anderson, Cullen, Maclaurin, and others. Thank you. You're muted, I think. Yeah.
Oh, yes, I sorted that. Thank you, Rebekah. Thank you very much. I will have some questions for you later on, but now, next up is Bill Jenkins. I will introduce Bill Jenkins to you. Just a second. Bill Jenkins is a lecturer in 19th century British history at the University of St. Andrews. He teaches courses on topics such as Charles Darwin and the politics of progress. And he has a book on the Victorians, religion, respectability, and print culture. Or are these the subjects that you are teaching, Bill?
Those are actually modules I teach. But I do have a book.
You teach. Yes. His research interests focuses on reception of Darwin before, ideas of evolution before Darwin, and I think you have also an established interest in the Scottish reception of Newtonianism in the 19th century. Are we going to hear more about this from you?
Yes, you are. This is actually what I'm going to give you is an abstract of a section from a book that I've just finished writing, and hopefully will be published sometime next year, which is going to be entitled David Brewster and the Culture of Science in Scotland, 1793 to 1843. So this is a little kind of taster of that, if you like. Anyway, I'm aware that the clock is ticking, so I'll say a little bit about what my interest is in Brewster and Newton. I'm sure you may know, Brewster is also famous for being a biographer of Newton. He wrote 2 biographies of Newton, in fact, in his life. Now, what I've entitled this section is Newton's Romantic Genius, David Brewster's reinvention of Newton for the 19th century. So, according to the philosopher Thomas Reid, Francis Bacon had found the true inductive method for establishing valid knowledge of the natural world, while Isaac Newton provided us with the finest example of the Baconian inductive method in action. As Reid wrote his inquiry into the human mind, the best models of inductive reasoning that have yet appeared, which I take to be the 3rd book of the Principia and the Optics of Newton, were drawn from Bacon's rules. Following Bacon's precepts, Reid had a strong distrust of speculative theorizing and acknowledged little positive role of the imagination in natural philosophy. It was largely Reid's views on Newton and Baconianism that the natural philosopher David Brewster would have imbibed in Dougal Stewart's moral philosophy lectures and Joan Robinson's natural philosophy classes at the University of Edinburgh in the 1790s. However, when Brewster came to write his biography of Newton in 1831, he presented a very different picture of both Newton and Bacon, claiming that the process of Lord Bacon was, we believe, never tried by any philosopher but himself, and certainly not by Newton. At around the same time as he was writing his biography of Newton, he was encouraging his young friend and protege, James David Forbes, to forget entirely all you've heard of Lord Bacon's philosophy, give full rein to your imagination. His belief in the power of the imagination, its central role in science as in art, set him apart from his philosophical forebears and can help explain his distaste for the dry, mechanical, inductive method of Bacon as he would have seen it. As he'd written to Edgeworth in 1824, Sir Isaac Newton, who is invariably said by some modern writers to have made all his discoveries following Bacon's rules, never once mentions either Bacon or his method. In place of Bacon's Newton, the Baconian Newton of the common sense philosophers, Brewster presents us with Newton, the romantic genius. Writing in his 1831 biography, we could ascribe to him that quickness of penetration and that exuberance of invention, which is more characteristic of poetical than of philosophical genius. If you remember that Brewster was something of a poet himself, having published a series of his own compositions in a magazine he edited in his youth, the Edinburgh Magazine and Literary Miscellany. Later he was to revel in being part of the literary circle around his publisher John Murray. And in a letter of 1816, he expressed delight in being published by the publisher of Lord Byron. In her biography of her father, his daughter was to declare that within him there was the element of the true poet. Brewster was also committed to evangelical, and his religious views may also have predisposed him to envisage Newton as an inspired genius. In representing Newton as a divinely inspired romantic genius, Brewster formed an image of the great natural philosopher that was both congenial to his own inclinations and to the mood of the times. He was truly a Newton for the 19th century, and this is reflected in the considerable commercial and critical success of Brewster's biography. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So shall we go to the questions? Because Tamas joined us, I would like to ask the first question to Tamas, if you don't mind, because I had planned it like that in the first place. So the chapter you kindly shared with us, in your work, you argued that Newtonianism has been expounded and appropriated in so many different ways in which in the Scottish context that a mere label cannot do good interpretive service here. These are your words. And so my question is, what then connects the different strands of Newtonianism or this following in Scotland in your view? If there is no typical Newtonian, what connects these Scottish intellectuals in the 18th century?
Well, there are, I think, more than one answer is possible to this question. The obvious link that connects them is the legitimacy that derive from Newton's immense success and reputation. So everyone wants to be a Newtonian, because if someone is a Newtonian, that he or she doesn't need to derive any further legitimacy from anywhere else. Apparently, well, certainly not for the better part of the century. That's more like a kind of sociological inspiration, or but beyond that, what connects them, the label Newtonian is still in order, but not as expressing a commitment to a shared body of doctrines, or but more like everyone. Well, Newton is a bit like a philosophical Rorschach test in the 18th century in the Scottish Enlightenment. Everyone sees in him whatever he or she wants to see in him. So if one wants to, those who are interested in some kind of demonstrativity and some kind of mathematical ideal for inquiry in general, they would turn to the Principia, and then the Principia will turn out to be the paradigmatic work, or the work that should be emulated in all kinds of inquiry. But then there is the insight that it gets stronger and stronger in the 30s and 70s, that mathematics may not be suitable for all fields of inquiry, but what is suitable for all fields of inquiry is some kind of experimental method. And then for those who who are interested in deploying this method in whatever field, and they will turn typically to the optics, because the optics is seen as the ideal embodiment of what experimental work should be. I think these are the main sources of inspirations, and if you just read the last query of the optics, 31st in the final numbering, then you will see that the analysis Newton suggests or proposes to both moral and natural philosophers is somehow, well, it's put forward in the phrase that, well, we should analyze phenomena in terms of motions and forces, or in terms of compounds and their ingredients. Now, these the second one is not necessarily a mathematized one, not necessarily an inquiry modeled on the Principia, but it might be modeled very easily on the Principia, on the optics and its prism experiment. When you just, there you've got a compound phenomena. You consider white light as a compound phenomena, use the prism, and then you see the ingredients there. And this approach, I think, is very much inspiring in chemistry and physiology, fields where mathematical attempts or mathematical formulations they're not very useful, especially at that time. Yeah, so that's that. I don't know if I'm answering your question adequately, so or at least my gestures towards an answer are visible.
Right. Well, I have certain ideas, but I'm not going to delve into the subject myself. We're going to have all of us, we're going to have a discussion anyway, so I'll just save my comments for that. Thank you for this, Tamas. Lewis is next up with the questions. Lewis also, shared his work with us. In your work, you talk about Scottish followers of Newton showing reluctance to assume all the aspects of Newton's philosophy, Newtonian philosophy. What particular aspect wasn't welcome? You talk about the implication of a religion, for example, in Newton's action at a distance, which may give the impression of denial of God's agency in nature by giving matter an active quality. Does this concern unite the readers of Newton under one theological argument?
Okay, so I would say what I think it's important to think about here is that there are important religious theological questions that are related to science, to natural philosophy in this period, because religion is important, and because natural philosophy throughout the 18th century, but especially I would say in the first half of the 18th century in Scotland, natural philosophical explanation or natural philosophical truth, scientific truths, are sort of just seen as giving you some kind of knowledge of God, so therefore some kind of religious truth. So the question's not whether they do, it's what they tell you. So Newton doesn't, I would say, and it doesn't seem to me, looking at what his readers reacted to his work by saying, doesn't seem to me that he gives you a very full answer to the natural theological and theological questions that would just pop into your mind reading the Principia naturally. So the main one for me, and the most difficult one, I think, for the period, was the question of what gravitation actually is. So in some way, God is responsible for it. God is the author of the universe. But what is this thing that seems to be such a powerful force in the sense of it permeates the universe, or has this universal quality? It explains things that have never been explained across human history before in really outstanding accuracy. So celestial physics. So especially I think in sort of immediate reaction to the Principia, it seems that gravitation is this extraordinary thing that might give you the answer to almost all physical questions, or some fundamental insight. So into, for example, the cohesion of matter. All matter is cohesive because of some kind of attractive force. The planets move according to the attractive force. So you have this extremely important force, maybe a sort of fundamental principle for some people in the universe. So the question is, what exactly is sort of God doing with that, if you like, as the creator? I think that people don't want to sort of reject things that Newton's said, because I don't think they need to do that, because it's quite concise what Newton gives you. I think what people do when they're asking these kinds of questions of divine agency, so questions about creation, why it's created that way, or what we can understand about God's purposes through creation, but also questions about how God actually still acts in the universe, because he sort of must still act for, I think, the vast majority of people in some way. So those are very tricky questions, and gravitation is a real challenge because it's this new thing. It seems to be an extremely important thing. So the issue really is that people are not accepting everyone else's interpretation of what Newton has kind of proved, or what Newton's conclusions and his physics give you regarding issues of religious truth, theology. Right. And this is important because religion is important to people personally, but also religion is important in society. So I suppose this for me is where Isla would come in. So when you have these major patrons, these people are genuinely, they're genuinely and seriously interested in the kind of morality of society. And when they're supporting intellectuals, in many cases, they want these intellectuals to kind of fight the good fight. And in the 18th century, we know that there are these controversial people, we call them deists, and there's lots of talk in the period about the rise of atheism and about the rise of deism. And I think what people do is they respond to that through natural theology, which is something that's happened in the 17th century. And it keeps going in the 18th century. And I think it gets a little bit of a push with the questions around gravitation. And so you have to kind of not necessarily just incorporate the truths that Newton gives you, but you have to kind of deal with the questions that naturally follow from the discovery of gravitation and everything it implies about what we know about the universe and how it works. And then you enter quite complex debates that are going in different directions around the role of reason in religion generally, which goes way beyond natural theology and is about all kinds of things, moral philosophy. But it's also about natural philosophy. So how do we justify knowledge of physical things? And how do we justify that knowledge being knowledge of God? And these things intersect. And I think Newton, especially, it seems to me, and this is not such a serious point, but I think because he's so concise and because he seems to have captured something so remarkable about the universe, it kind of like, it's a tricky one where you can really interpret it in different ways. But so it doesn't give you much, but it just seems like this really powerful sort of, it's just, this really sort of powerful treatment of the universe. That's this kind of concise package that Newton doesn't make any real, for me, definitive statements about these religious questions that allow people to be to disagree quite a lot about what his treatment specifically of the issues and just the issues themselves that people agree he's discovered, what they entail. So that really helps drive this engagement, serious engagement with his works, and also with the concept of gravitation in particular, but also other aspects that sort of follow and connect from that about his physics, those aspects of his physics that are seen as particularly Newtonian and particularly important, like the laws of motion and stuff like that. They connect to this stuff through these fundamental questions about what can we know about God and religion through physics, and how can we think about God acting in the world.
Right. Thank you so much. I have some kind of information for all of us. We have 5 minutes extra added to our panel, so it's going to finish at around to the full hour, I think. We can
Is
do
that because I took so long to answer that
No,
question?
Sarah just messaged me because we started
Good.
late, you know. No. Rebekah, you said to me at the beginning of the panel, you're not going to delve into the curatorial aspects of your interests today. So do you want to, I was actually going to ask you about this sundial.
Yeah, that's great, because I didn't talk about it before, so you please ask the question.
Okay. The sundial that you were talking about, National Museum of Scotland acquired a sundial, or acquiring, in the process of acquiring a sundial, which Isla commissioned. So I would like to ask you, how is it possible to convey an intellectual figure's interests like Isla as a reader of Newton, antiquarian who was interested in collecting Newtonian works, and how to display these interests, these networks in the museum? What kind of a challenge is this?
A big challenge, because you can't do very much justice to many stories with a single object. And it's a complicated object as well. It doesn't look like a sundial to most people. It looks a little bit more like a armillary sphere or something, because it is modeling the sun's path as it appears to go around the earth, or indeed around monogram of Archibald Campbell, which is in the center of this. So he almost puts himself at the center of the solar system, which I love. But people will want to know what the object is and how it works. And then we have to say who Isla was and why he's important. So we have this London-made instrument and this London context that I've been talking about that is one we probably don't want to dwell on in the context of the gallery it's likely to go in, which is the Spirit of the Age in the Museum of Scotland, which tells the story of the Scottish Enlightenment, but tells it in a way, rather devoid of texts and ideas, which is the kind of stuff that we're talking about, because they are difficult to display. So we do have antiquary. He wasn't actually not an antiquarian himself, but we do have the Society of Antiquaries very much represented there. We have improvers of land, agriculture. We have other things he was connected to very closely. So the Edinburgh Medical School. We have displays of Joseph Black's glassware. He was a patron to Black. So there are lots and lots of connections, but it's not easy to signal that from one object. So I find this still very difficult. I like the idea perhaps of bringing in Desaguliers' book. I don't think we have a copy, but perhaps we could borrow one or use a graphic, since it is dedicated to him. And you could talk about that, his role in terms of the Union and sort of Hanoverian Scotland, perhaps, but you absolutely can't do everything. So it's going to be a long discussion. I'm here partly to get ideas from other people as well. All thoughts towards this would be very useful. I suspect we will talk about him as a patron, the people that he put in professorial chairs and so on, rather than getting deep into what Newtonianism meant and whether it was something that impacted Scottish Enlightenment. That story currently is not there. It's a difficult one to do.
True. Yes. Thank you. Bill, last question. And just before our discussion begins, as a panel and with the audience, this whole debate, action at a distance, plenum versus vacuum. And Lewis talked about, mysterious gravity, the reason of the gravity. These are at the heart of the debate about Newtonian cosmology in general. So the ether discussion, is it abandoned by the 19th century? The reactions to Newton's introduction of ether later on, or what's happening in the 19th century?
Well, the ether becomes the center of the 19th century, one of the big debates of the period, which is also to do with the nature of light. There are two rival theories as to what light actually is. One of which is that it consists of particles of some kind, the particle theory of light. The other one is the wave or undulatory theory of light, which suggests that light is actually just ripples in a medium of some kind, like the ripples in a pond when you throw a stone in, or sound waves. Now, if sound consists of particles, then particles can travel through empty space. There's no problem with that. But if light is a waveform of some kind, it needs a medium to travel through. And so this raises the question of what fills the space between the stars that allows light to travel from them to us. So in general, the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment period of the 18th century, people like Reid, and then later on Dougal Stewart and Thomas Brown, very much believed that light was a particle, and they believed that Newton had believed that. And Newton is actually used by both sides in this debate as an authority, because he has such enormous standing that he is a very powerful person to have on your side. So both sides try to kind of recruit him to their side of this debate. But the Scottish Enlightenment, the Scottish philosophical tradition tends to distrust introducing entities which you can't sense in some way. And ether is like this. It's what they call a subtle fluid. So it's considered to be a fluid which is much less substantial than even a gas. So it can penetrate and pass through solid objects without causing any sort of, without even being noticed. So you can't see it, you can't smell it. It's undetectable, and this made it a very suspicious thing for the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, who tended to believe that all knowledge came from sense impressions ultimately, and the idea of introducing also the Humean idea that you can determine, at least our knowledge of cause and effect all comes through observing the conjunction of phenomena, and this is where we derive natural law from. The idea of introducing a kind of third term in the middle of the causal chain, which you can't actually see or detect in any way, is sort of is really anathema to their way of looking at things. And this attitude kind of continues into the 19th century. So Brewster himself, but also John Leslie, John Robeson at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 18th century, they also are very much espouse the particle theory. Whereas the wave theory had been around for a while. Christian Huygens had suggested a version of it several centuries before. Around 1800, Thomas Young had also produced a formulation of it, but it really took off in the early 19th century at Cambridge, and among the individuals like William Whewell, John Herschel, and the kind of Cambridge mathematical physicists. So it took on a national dimension as well. You had Scots such as Brewster, who were very much promoting the particle theory. And then you had the Cambridge mathematical physicists who were promoting the wave theory, which required ether to exist. So Brewster was very much believed that ether didn't exist. And this debate kind of goes on really throughout the 19th century. The wave theorists really win the debate. in the 19th century. And it's not until the early 20th century they find that finally it's proved that ether doesn't really exist at all. So when Brewster's view becomes increasingly a minority view towards the end of his life, and he becomes quite marginalized, which is a bit sad for him. He didn't live to see his belief that the ether was a fiction vindicated in the end.
Okay. So we have 5 minutes. The question and answers part on the Zoom window is designated for our audience, but I'll just check if there is anything, but no, there isn't. So we'll wait and we'll just, kind of have an open discussion among each other, among ourselves. So yeah, I have asked all the questions. Yes, Lewis?
I have a question if we want to pick up from what Bill just said.
Yes.
I was just wondering, Bill, in relation to what I said, what you think the role of religion and God played in Brewster's science and natural philosophy, because I've looked a little bit, but I don't know very much about Brewster, and it seems to me that he kind of treats the fact that Newton has proved amazing things as, a boon for religion, but kind of doesn't really take it anywhere. And I'm wondering about the sincerity and kind of the seriousness, whether he thinks these are interesting questions or whether they're just not interesting questions for him, the kind of questions I was talking about.
No, I think he very much does believe they're interesting questions. I mean, he's a committed evangelical. He has very deeply held religious beliefs, and but at the same time, he actually explicitly says that while science and religion are both ways of learning about God, they should also, they're separate things too, and you shouldn't really mix them up too much. But at the same time, he's not very good at keeping his own, following his own advice there, because in particular, in relation to the nebular hypothesis, which I don't know how much you know about that, but the idea that the universe, the solar system condensed out of a cloud of gas and dust, and ultimately, according to some versions of the theory, will then coalesce back into another big blob of gas and dust at the end of time as well. And Brewster really likes the idea of this because it seems to reflect the idea that the universe has a beginning and an end. And he sees especially this ending, this fiery ending, as being very closely related to the kind of apocalyptic ideas that he finds in the book of Revelations. And he takes the prophetic books of the Bible very seriously as well, and looks for parallels between them and what he sees happening on a cosmological scale as well, and in science. So yeah, I think he does take it very seriously, and he does sometimes allow his religious views very much to guide his scientific opinions as well.
I think we've lost Derya at the moment,
yeah.
But I'm going to take over chairing and ask Tamas to ask questions since your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you. My question is somewhat related, and it's also addressed to Bill. I mean, is there anything in the 19th century reflecting this ether controversy that went on in Edinburgh between William Cullen and Smellie in the late 60s, early 70s? So is there any remnants of that controversy or any kind of Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment explorations into the concept or metaphysics of ether?
So my understanding of the debate is largely based on its function as the luminiferous ether, that plays this important role in the debate on the nature of light. In terms of its, I know Newton also proposed a role for it in gravitation as well, in a sort of kind of in a speculative sort of way too. That I don't think really that debate really continued on in the 19th century, as far as I know. The ether is largely seen as as a kind of medium pervading the universe, which is the medium that carries light. That's its main role. I mean, obviously that raises all kinds of issues, like the fact that even as a very subtle fluid, a very tenuous thing indeed, you would expect it to have some effect on the planets as they revolve around the sun. You'd expect it to slow them down. There'd be a certain amount of drag, and there's a big debate of why this isn't the case as well. But yeah, I don't know if these specific debates continue really on into so much into the 19th century.
Thank you.
I'm going to just jump in, and I wanted to ask it because we're in although it wasn't particularly the way we presented our panel, we've ended up on a day about geographies of science. So I just wanted to get some more thoughts on what is particular about Scotland in this discussion, as far as you're concerned. I think in thinking about Isla, it's obviously the Union is a huge context, and he's largely based in England, but certainly comes up to Scotland and is very concerned to maintain the distinct nature of Scottish institutions. He doesn't want to form them in the mould of England. So there's interesting things happening there. But I'd love to learn more from you guys as to what you think is important about Scotland.
Shall I start what I think? The assumption I actually picked up when I was writing my paper on Duncan Forbes of Culloden. He's a Presbyterian Whig, but he's a Hutchinsonian, so he's quite feverishly anti-Newtonian. So I'm really bothered about certain assumptions that Presbyterian Whigs welcome the Union, and they are more open to, Newtonian ideas. Establishmentarian. So I really understand, and I really sign myself to that school of thought where religion, politics. So I actually stand where intellectual history meets history of science. So, those issues are relevant to me. So there is no special definition that I can actually say what makes Scottish anti-Newtonians or Scottish Newtonians so special, if you know what I mean. So it started with the national Scottish Enlightenment paradigm, didn't it? Everybody questioned it. And now, it's still used as a term, and obviously, you can fill the term in various ways, but one should be careful with the labelings about who followed Newton, who criticized Newton, and who were Newtonians. Were they a camp to be easily identifiable with certain political and religious connotations? I'm not sure.
It's interesting that Isla was also a patron to Forbes, so being anti-Newtonian wasn't necessarily a problem, as long as he felt that it was for someone who was useful politically or useful,
sure,
in terms of his skills or whatever it was. Any other takers for that question?
Okay, go ahead, Louise.
I'll try to be brief. I think, I'll just say one thing related to what I've been talking about. So I think there are a couple of things, but one, I think, important thing is that in Scotland, the religious debates, which I'm trying to insist are important, they're different, which is quite natural following from the different religious situation in Scotland. So they're different, and that does affect things. So to give one example and pick up on the ether discussion, it seems to me that in the 18th century, when you're talking about ether as a material that helps you, or you use this existence of this material to explain gravitation, it seems to me that people in Scotland are largely uninterested in this question, and they think it's kind of weird to think about it, because there's a sort of voluntaristic conception of God's action where God can just act wherever he wants, and this action at a distance problem, it's not a problem at all. It's not even really an interesting question. And so if that is a problem and an interesting question for someone like Samuel Clarke, who's debating with Leibniz early in the century, then it's not maybe it's maybe a bit of a difference theologically between Scotland and England, or there may be just different theological currents that are bound up with the different religious situation that does affect this natural philosophical conversation. That's as brief as I'll be.
I was actually going to ask you a question about exactly that point, so I'm glad you got there before. But no, this idea that this voluntarist idea that the laws of nature are just God's will at work constantly in the universe is something you come across, and it really that does definitely go into the 19th century. The thought of people like Thomas Chalmers, for example, who wrote his astronomical discourses, and talks about God being, in action in all places at all times. And so that's an idea that's interesting, because I hadn't realised how far back that idea goes. That goes right back into the 18th century in Scotland, I guess.
Yeah, so I haven't mentioned any names, but I would just say Andrew Baxter, if you're interested in this question. Andrew Baxter in mid-century, he has this particular idea where God basically literally does everything moment to moment. And he thinks that that's proven by certain things that don't add up in science, like the lunar motion, which has not yet been determined. He thinks that that's actually because God just does it. So yeah, and this is very different to other people, and there are some debates around
that. Thank you, all of us, every one of us, for this. Although we didn't receive questions, we managed to pass 5 minutes to our panel time already. So I'm gonna, end this session. Thank you so much for joining in, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.